Mike Munger, welcome to Dad Saves America.
It is great to be on the show, John. Thank you.
I first encountered you and your work in political science through Russ Roberts' podcast, Econ Talk, which is where I learned. I started my second wave of intellectual journey as an adult. And you were the longtime chair of the political science department at Duke University, which is a great school, and appears to have not been wholly corrupted by evil. So that's saying something.
I am glad to be there. I've been at Duke almost 30 years. I wouldn't have been anyplace else.
And most recently, I put a bunch of work together with the team into a video called America is Not a Democracy. And I called you up because I wanted to make sure I understood this very esoteric concept called Arrow's impossibility theorem. And then we started talking about it, and I was like, oh my God, Mike, we got to talk about all this stuff. So for those of you who haven't seen that video, you should check it out. This conversation is going to be a great sidecar to that. What is America's form of government?
Let me first say what democracy is. One of the problems with democracy is not the lack of definitions, but their superfluity. There are so many different definitions of democracy. And for many people, democracy is just good government. So if it's something they agree with, that's democracy. If it's something they disagree with, it's not. Democracy bears some relationship to the will of the people. So we tend to think of democracy as being a government which does what the people want. And who could be opposed to that? That sounds like a really great idea. Now, the American form of government is explicitly designed often not to do what the people want. And that seems problematic because the American form of government is a constitutional republic. Now, I would say that's still a democracy because for me, a democracy is the tension between two opposing forces. One is the desire for the government to be responsive to the will of the people, but the other, and that's in tension, is a system which protects the rights, prerogatives, and autonomy of individuals. And so the question is, how do you balance those things? And in the American system, you don't have to go any farther than the First Amendment to see where the founders tried to balance those things. So we have a constitution, we have a list of things that government can do, we have the way that legislation can be passed, and the First Amendment is unequivocal. It says, Congress shall make no law. And then there's 5 things or domains in which Congress can do literally nothing if you read it literally. Now, we've fiddled around with the meaning of it, but if you read the First Amendment literally, Congress shall make no law in any of these 5 domains. So a constitutional republic is a set of rules that define decision-making processes within their proper domain, and then it establishes a set of domain in which government has no power and where individuals are free to create their own emergent structures. So it doesn't mean there's no rules. It means that we're going to come up with rules that voluntarily we're going to say, this is what we're going to do. And so the United States famously from the very beginning, as it was described by Alexis de Tocqueville in his book, Democracy in America, in 1830, not long after the founding of the American Republic, America was famous for having these voluntary private associations that were able to grow up precisely because the powers of government in these domains were limited. So I think that's the shortest way that I can answer is that the United States has a kind of democratic spirit, but it has a set of rules that are a constitutional republic that make democracy sustainable. Because democracy is not sustainable unless there are limits that prevent it from eating itself.
All right, I'll keep this quick. If you like what you're hearing and want to hear more, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel so you won't miss our new content as it comes out every week. And now, back to the conversation.
As we sit here today, there is an example of fake democracy taking place in Venezuela, where there was an election which appears to have been decisively won by the opposition to the Chavista regime that's currently being run by Maduro. And he's like, nah, I'm still in. No, you lost. You lost because I say so.
So there's the keys to the tanks. When you think of it, isn't that amazing? The United States is an amazing experiment in self-governance because you've put your finger on the key thing. A miracle happened in the year 1800, something that had never happened before. The people who had the 19th century equivalent to the keys to the tanks. That is, they'd appointed all the generals, all of the Army, the Navy, all of these people were directly beholden to President John Adams. He said, you know what? Damn it, we lost. Here you go, Thomas Jefferson. I voluntarily hand over to you the keys to power. It had never happened before in the history of the world. We tend to take it for granted. The fact that we have violent revolutions that are restricted in form to elections, where we call each other names and then we make decisions and then we respect that outcome. That's something we take for granted. It doesn't happen in most of history, and it doesn't happen in most of the world. So we have to be really worried about that. So the Venezuela example is not an outlier. That's the way it has worked most of history and still in most of the world. The United States and a few other democracies are precious exceptions to those things. And the question is, why? Why would you hand over the keys to the tanks? It makes no sense.
I'm surprised, actually, that you point to 1800 instead of George Washington sort of voluntarily not seeking a third term. So why? Why do you look at the Adams-Jefferson battle and call that out as being the moment that's unique and historic?
We were really lucky to have George Washington. And so institutionally, your recommendation for other nations cannot be have someone who's really awesome. I just got back from Chile. I work on the Chilean constitution. The country of Chile is trying to design a new constitution. They have all of these founding fathers. They all suck. They've got this guy named Bernardo O'Higgins. So he was an Irish, Spanish, basically dictator. And he's their George Washington. And basically he had to be killed to be removed from office. So I admit George Washington is really awesome. But to whom did he hand over the keys to the tanks? John Adams, who was from his same party.
Right.
That's not that big a deal. That's more like passing on to somebody in my family. Now, parties are a kind of political family. So I agree that was a miracle. We're really lucky to have George Washington, but he handed over the keys to somebody in the same party. What happened in 1800 was that somebody who John Adams and the Federalists didn't trust and hated, Thomas Jefferson, they said, okay.
There's so much in our discourse right now that's weird. Or maybe it's not weird historically, but it feels weird. But one of the things is the attack on our democracy. The democracy as a thing to love has become partisan. If you're on the left, you're saying our democracy is under threat. You've been saying it since 2016. You were given a little gift in that January 6th sure looked yucky.
It was yucky.
And it was not good.
Yeah.
And it was not in keeping with Thomas Jefferson losing gracefully. Even though to call it an insurrection's weird, because you'd think maybe somebody would have brought a gun for the insurrection. That's always a little awkward. Like, let's have an insurrection. Like, who's got a gun? Nah, we're just going to
we'll go with yucky.
Take selfies.
Yucky is the technical political science. So we'll just stick with yucky.
But what do you make of the discourse around democracy and the protection of our democracy right now?
You put your finger on another really important point, and this is actually deeply disconcerting because I think very few people outside of what I would say is my movement in political science and economics, I do a kind of political science and economics called public choice.
Yeah.
And so the arguments that public choice makes, I think, have an answer to this. But our educational system, the grade school, high school, even in college, what they teach democracy is something else. There's two ways of thinking about democracy, and these were starkly contrasted in a 1980 book by a guy named William Riker, and it's called Liberalism against Populism. His conception of functional democracy was liberalism. It is essential that we use something like competitive elections where people on all, I wouldn't say both because I'm a libertarian, on all sides are allowed access to the public agenda where they can make arguments using the resources that are required to persuade. So they actually have access to mass media, they make arguments, and then the public judges among these different competing visions of optimistic visions of the future or maybe pessimistic. We have to do this thing.
Yeah.
And then...
or stop that thing.
Stop doing this thing. Let's do this thing instead. And when we have this contest, the result might not be truth, but it's something closer to consensus. And the difficulty that we have is that, so that's liberalism. Liberalism would say that elections are the process by which we make decisions. That doesn't mean that it has any truth value. It doesn't mean that it has some moral force. It's just the way that we decide things because there's no better way. As imperfect as it is, there's no better way. Populism claims there's actual moral force that's inherent in the will of the majority. And so it is not only treason, it's morally wrong for you to oppose the will of the majority. So Rousseau, in The General Will, the French philosopher Jean-Jacques Rousseau famously asked, how can it be that a man is both free and yet bound by wills not his own? That's a great question. That's the essence of democracy, because we're all free. We're going to decide what the speed limit is. I happen to have a BMW 330, and I'm just the you think I am. I'm going to pull up behind you and flash my lights. I should go
like
fast. I am more awesome than you are because I have a damn BMW.
Why is it the Beamers are always terrible?
I don't know if it's selection or what. Maybe it causes that. You just have this sense of superiority. But the police the police will pull me over, and I can't say, well, yeah, I understand. We voted on speed limit, but I voted against it, so I'm exempt. I'm bound by wills not my own. Okay. And the reason is that's how we have to make decisions. But suppose I say, I think the speed limit should be higher or lower. I can put up a sign and say, I think the speed limit should be higher or lower. So in a republic, you can do that. Rousseau's answer, his question was great, but his answer went off the rails. His answer was, I would retort the question is wrongly put. The answer is neither more nor less than that he who opposes the majority is mistaken, and that what he thought to be what he calls the general will was not so. And that's why there's so many countries that have democratic republic of something in their names.
And they're always awful.
Well, how many parties do they have? One. They have one party because opposition to the truth is treason. So in a competitive democracy, liberalism, we rely on that kind of competition in order to produce something approximating consensus. And I get to argue against it. The fact that the consensus has survived attempts to overturn it by people who had the resources to do it if their arguments were persuasive. That's liberalism. Populism is, oh no, we know what to do. And if you oppose it, we're going to do what the Soviet Union did. Where did dissidents go in the Soviet Union? One of two places, prisons or insane asylums. And the distinction could often be murky. Because you're either crazy or evil if you oppose the will of the people. So that's populism. What terrifies me, and the reason that you say, what is the threat? The U.S. is verging over into populism. And I see that from both of the two state-sponsored parties, both the Democrats and the Republicans are unwilling to concede that their opponents might have something at least useful to say. I don't know if it's true, but we should allow them to argue. Instead, we're going to try to cancel them and cut them off because they're wrong. They are morally mistaken to be able to make that argument. So the U.S. is not and cannot be a populist country. It's a liberal country. But we're seeing this, the temptations of populism, the thing that broke Argentina, Turkey, Poland, Hungary. Populism is a very dangerous political sentiment because it allows demagogues to say not, my enemy is mistaken, but my enemy is immoral. And it is okay for us then to try to take action against them. We haven't gotten to that point yet, but I'm worried that we're going to become Argentina.
For a while, and I think it's partly because of the exposure I've had to some of the history of Argentina through Econ Talk and other places, Argentina seems like maybe the most useful example of how we can go off the rails.
Although Venezuela too, the recent what's happened in Venezuela, which was your question.
Yeah.
What's happened in Venezuela is that we already know who the right system of government is, and if we have some inconvenient fact, like the misguided people vote against it, we can ignore that because we already know the truth. And so Venezuela has become a one-party state. Argentina became, through the Peronismo, they became kind of a fascist state, but with populist support for labor rather than for increases in productivity and free competition. And so forgive me for interrupting, but it is important to connect this back to your Venezuela point. That's what's happening, is populism has been so entrenched in Venezuela that it actually no longer matters what the majority of the voters want, because the government knows the right thing to do. It will represent the general will of the people.
My understanding is that at the turn of the last century, Argentina was like per capita similar to the US. It was like a wealthy, on the rise society that was a first world nation by the standards of the 1920s, 30s, 40s.
They had a powerful military. A lot of their wealth came from commodities, and that's always a dangerous thing to do. But they were on the verge of making the transition to industrial capitalism. And then they went in the direction of populism politically, and that was the end of that. So they had what should have been the preconditions for becoming a first world nation, but they failed because populism turned them aside. And it's actually amazing that doesn't happen more often. How did we make it?
For someone who's hearing populism as you're framing it and feels like, I don't know if I agree with the way you're framing this, because the way I think about populism is there's all these sort of elites in our society that all go to the same dinner parties and they all sort of live similar lives. And, as Charles Murray wrote in his book, Coming Apart, like lived literally physically in similar areas, have a similar culture. You could say like there's this superstructure in the coasts from Boston, which is the world of the academics, through New York, the world of finance, through DC, the world of Congress and legislation and lobbyists. This sort of super belt, super zips of elite. And then in California, you have tech and Hollywood. And these two things represent elites, elite culture, elite control. And in comes a guy Donald Trump, who is a reality TV guy, which is not elite, which is, for example, even in the entertainment business, the producer of Survivor is like a religious right-winger. Like he keeps it quiet, but reality TV is the place where you go for basically flyover country. I'm here in Texas, like reality TVs where there's all kinds of shows on HGTV that celebrate how much profit you made on flipping your house at the end. So there seems like there's this other populism that feels different than what you're talking about, that is about like the people or a subset of the people seeing an elite class as having taken the controls of the institutions and using them to enrich themselves and frankly screw everyone else. I think there's something to that, isn't there?
You bet.
So what's going on there, and how does that relate to the populism you're talking about, which is this sort of, we the people is an abstraction, but in reality, I'm just Xi Jinping, and it's the People's Republic of my China.
I said that the U.S., when it works properly, is a liberal nation in the sense that it is a constitutional republic. And I posed one of the threats to liberalism as being populism. And that's true, but there are others. There's an amazingly virile, powerful threat to liberalism, which is the elite illiberalism of American universities, the intellectual elite, and the artistic and tech elite. Now, some of the tech elite are sort of pro-market, but they're not really They believe they know what is the right thing to do, and they believe that they should be in charge. That's illiberalism. Illiberalism is the actual belief that no one should be in charge. Even if I have the chance, if I have the chance to be in charge, I should say no. No one should be in charge. Because anyone who's in charge, it's like the ring of Sauron. It will turn you, and it will make you evil. That power will make you evil. And so we need more George Washington. So there is a threat to liberalism, which is the cancer of illiberalism that we have seen largely take over a lot of the elite universities. Now, there are some universities where it's much, much less true. Chapman University in California, George Mason University, Clemson, there's a number of universities where it's much less true. Hillsdale. So you can find some.
Yeah.
But all the
you
elite,
could say all the right-wing universities.
well, but the
and departments.
These are right-wing in part in reaction to the illiberalism that you find in the elite universities. So if I look, and I Duke, as I said before, I'm very happy to be at Duke because I don't see that kind of illiberalism. When I look at departments, I don't see the same ideologically monochrome. They range from the left to the far left in many of the illiberal universities.
Harvard.
So the threat, watching the double standard at work in the speeches that were given by the university presidents after the Hamas attack in October, suddenly they became sort of tepid defenders of free speech. So, a few months ago, if you had made a joke about some protected class, that's no good. But if you make threats saying we're going to wipe out Israel and kill all the Jews, well, that's okay. We've got to protect free speech. So there's a weird illiberalism at the universities that has created a fecund setting, a fertile setting for what I see as the demagoguery of populism. Not everything that populists say is wrong. Sometimes populists are on the left. Sometimes populists are on the right. So it's not that populism is right-wing. Populism is a revolt against what they see as excessive control by elites or by rules. So populists are impatient with the restrictions that are placed on what they can do by the Constitution. And that's what's terrifying. It seems to me when I talk to young people on the left or the right, used to be conservatives would say something about, well, the U.S. is a constitutional republic. There was a conservative tradition of liberalism that conservatives tried to preserve. Young conservatives now say, no, that battle's lost. If you tell me I have to abide by the Constitution, it means I'm fighting with one hand behind my back. Screw the Constitution. We have to take over, and if the Constitution dies, so be it. So that's what populism is resistance to elites and to the Constitution.
I saw there was a recent CNN special or episode, I forget what the show was, but it was basically coming at this conversation, and it was saying America's a democracy in the most simpleton way possible, just like, oh, we have elections or something. Like it doesn't define what it is.
So does Venezuela. You can have elections, but
it was mocking exactly what we're talking about, the notion of a constitutional republic that's bound by an actual structure, and democracy is part of it, but it's not the whole story. And they actually went out and did man on the street at, conservative rallies. And it was mostly older folks. But the funny thing about the special was the people in the crowd, to sort of counter what you're saying, actually were saying exactly that. They're like, no, what are we? And this was the CNN gotcha. Oh, we're a constitutional republic.
Old people do. Old people say that. I agree. It's the young people on the right that frighten me. Old people are conservatives. They're trying to conserve the liberal tradition. So I'm active in an organization called the Philadelphia Society. I'm going to be president of the Philadelphia Society term after next. And the young people that I talk to there uniformly say, Constitution is just getting in our way. We have to take over. We have to put our people in charge, and then we need to stay in charge forever because a powerful government is actually useful. Not liberalism, which is no powerful government is possible because it will be misused. The way I always put it is, you should never make a sword so large and sharp that you don't want it used against you immediately after the next election. And so these young conservatives are saying, we need to have this really powerful central government. So Kamala Harris can run it? What are you thinking? Even if we win, we're not going to win forever. And so you're absolutely right, and it's important to make that distinction. Older people, for the most part, will say, no, it's a republic. This is important. It's a republic. I'm worried about concentrations of power. Now, I realize old people always think young people are going to hell in a handbasket.
Fair. Yes.
But old people are right. Young people are going to hell in a handbasket. This movement on the right, the unprecedented recruitment of young conservatives by populists, mean that everybody, left and right, agree we need to get rid of the Constitution. All we need to do is decide who's going to be in charge of whatever rises from those ashes, and it will be fascistic.
You were talking about, the Philadelphia Society. There's all kinds of organizations like this, sort of political. They're sort of a self-selecting group in a certain sense. These are, whether you're on the left or the right, these sort of civil society nonprofits. They attract people who are super into politics and policy and philosophy, either as academics or as young policy wonks, wannabe politicians, etc. Is that a skewed view of the movement of people who see themselves as being young and either excited about Trump or just see themselves as being right of center?
It is a very skewed view, but it ties into your excellent point about what about elites. There has been a change on the elites of the right. The left has always been illiberal. The left elite is not populist. They don't give a damn what the people think. They know what the people should think. And we'll do that, and then, we'll educate them. So like Pol Pot, we'll send them out to the countryside, we'll re-educate them, and then they'll do the right thing. Because once we have control of the educational facilities, and they largely do, then we'll just tell them what to think. The right hasn't been like that.
My favorite example of that is Elizabeth Warren. So here you have this Harvard professor academic who claims to be for the people and claims to care about democracy, but her shining political achievement is the creation of an agency inside the Fed that is funded by the Fed, which itself. So it's not funded by tax dollars, and has, and in its structure, this is the Consumer Products or CFPB, like it's a Consumer Finance
Protection Bureau.
It is the least democratic thing maybe ever designed in American governance. It has no democratic accountability. In fact, if I remember correctly, when President Trump took office in 2016, and the sitting director of this agency was set to have his term expire, there were some machinations that, if I remember correctly, were something like, no, I'm just going to appoint my successor. Like, no, the president can't have any role in this. So there was literally, they were asserting zero democracy. It was a zero democracy, autocratic control board funded by the printing press.
This is the Rousseauian definition of democracy. It is why Rousseauian democracies have only one party, because the group that is in charge has to rule in a way that benefits the people. And the people are not very good judges of what benefits them. There's a tradition that goes back to Cambridge University economists in the 1920s. So the public choice people like me, we often say, well, economists don't really understand that politics will distort the incentives of regulations, and regulatory agencies will be captured. Capture theory says that they'll actually benefit the regulated more than they will the people.
Yes.
In fact, I've written a couple of papers recently that have gotten a fair amount of attention. This was clearly understood by the Cambridge economists in England and in the U.S. So both Harvard, MIT, Cambridge, and Oxford all recognized that democracy was a real problem for good politics. What they thought of as good politics is, what if voters were better informed and really understood economics, what would they do? We need to create an institutional structure that yields that outcome. And the only way to do that is to create agencies that are completely insulated from the hoi polloi. And when we do that, what is it that they should do? Well, we're the experts. We know the people who they thought embodied the general will were the people they saw in the mirror. Look how awesome I am. Damn, you look good. Don't you ever die. That's the I should be in charge. And that is Elizabeth Warren.
Yes.
She knows what should be done. Now, the only way you can make sure that what should be done will be done is to create this priesthood, a self-replicating priesthood that has a set of secular sacraments, these economics books, and they're going to enforce that according to their view of morality and immorality. And that's what we're moving towards in the illiberal part of U.S. government. Now, we have some things like that. The Federal Reserve, the Supreme Court, they're insulated to some extent. But there's an appointment process. The Consumer Finance Bureau that you've mentioned is the future. And I worry that it's the future whether or not the left or the right gain power, because the recognition that we don't want voters messing up with our permanent power, our knowledge of the right thing to do. So there are many sources of illiberalism. Right now, the dominant elite ones on the left, and we shouldn't just pick on Elizabeth Warren, there are many, but she's perhaps the most egregious because she says out loud the things that you're just supposed to think to yourself. We're going to make sure that no filthy voters are able to interfere with my enormous knowledge.
I had Bill de Blasio on the show, and I noted something about American history on the progressive left that he agreed with, and that was that there were these two threads. There was the populism, the sort of more bottom-up focus of people like William Jennings Bryan, who would say, look at all these like Wall Street elites that are screwing farmers with their loans that farmers can't repay if there's a bad crop cycle, and we need to have free silver and stuff like that. There was all kinds of things like that, but it was a kind of like J.D. Vance is as much a William Jennings Bryan type as Bernie Sanders, in a sense. I know people won't like this. We're in the political time, so everybody gets all triggered, but that's a fact. But then you had the proto-Elizabeth Warren, Claudine Gay types, like Woodrow Wilson, who I consider to just be like an absolute monstrous villain of American history along every imaginable dimension, racist, eugenicist, ultra elite, constructor of essentially the precursors to World War II in his handling of the League of Nations and the aftermath of World War I. Like, he's just like the worst. And he became like infirmed and basically and his wife was president for the final stages. So like everything bad about the left is like embodied in Woodrow Wilson. It seems like most of the political left has just become Woodrow Wilson. Like there's just, it's Woodrow Wilson's party now in total.
There is a strain on what we call the Democratic Party. There are some people who are kind of leftists. And then there's this other thing, progressivism. And progressivism is weird. It doesn't fit well with the left. And so progressivism says that policy should be driven by science, not politics. And so what we've been talking about, Elizabeth Warren is a progressive, not a leftist. If you actually look at her views, she's pro-market in a bunch of ways. She just thinks that things should be directed by really smart people like, well, her. And so that progressives have taken over the Democratic Party. There's very little old style left. And this really pisses off the old style left. Yeah. They're worried about class. They were worried about problems of we need to identify with labor. Well, the reason the Democrats lost in 2016 was they've abandoned labor in favor of identitarian excesses. So it doesn't actually matter what class you're in now. It matters what protected class. We're interested not in a diversity of views, but a diversity of hues. The different color that you have. So if I can identify a particular identity, that's the thing that is going to guarantee me access to privilege. And so the progressives have just gone nuts, and we call it wokeism, but it's a whole suite of things. The left is dying among Democrats. What's taken over is progressivism. And progressivism is dedicated to the proposition we want science, not politics. But their notion of science is this weird identitarian wokeism.
You see this in a lot of people sort of in the online media space. There's a Breaking Point, the Breaking Points folks. There's comedian Jimmy Dore, who I watch a lot, who came up through the left. And now it sure seems like he supports Donald Trump for president, or at least he hates everyone that opposes him, and mocks them. But he simultaneously talks about wanting strong unions and free health care and sort of like the old left sort of laundry list, a kind of equality. So mocking equal outcomes, but a certain level of social safety net and support for workers and that sort of thing. A more like old Marxism, not this new Marxism where we take the class struggle and just transplant it onto color and gender and all that stuff. That puts us in a strange spot because the alliances are shifting. And maybe let's take a step back here. We're using these terms left and right. For someone that isn't familiar with the background, how do you understand what is left and what is right? Like, what do those words mean to you?
I'm an extremist on this question. The tradition of left and right comes from the time of the French Revolution. And so the Girondins and the Jacobins were on different sides of their sense of the urgency of the need for change. So these two groups, Girondins, Jacobins, both were part of the revolution, and now they're part of the assembly. And it happened that the Jacobins sat in this weird bunch of bleachers that were from the perspective of the speaker, it went way up. Then they're just hooting and throwing stuff, and that was on the left.
Okay.
And over here on the right are the Girondins. Now, the Girondins mostly they were good government types. They wanted to maintain bureaucrats that were well-trained and were experts. The Jacobins wanted to burn it all down. It's all going to be democracy, and we'll just execute all the people we disagree with. So the right, at that point, came to mean people who were basically defending the status quo. They're conservatives in the sense they want to conserve the status quo. They're going to stand athwart history and shout stop. The left is trying for radical change. Now, it could be radical change in the direction of free markets. It could be radical change in the direction of communism. But so that was the traditional meaning. This got jumbled up into Marxism, where the left was for socialism and for freeing labor from the shackles of capitalism, and the right was partly pro-market, but it was also the right was identitarian. So Hitler clearly is an identitarian. Mm-hmm. He is for whiteness. And so that's what conservatism meant. And then it basically broke. I think the meanings left and right, I wrote a book about this in 1994 called Ideology and the Theory of Political Choice. And it was not a popular book because my claim is these terms are contingent on social and political culture in a way that mean that they have no meaning across time or across culture. So if you want to say, what is the left or right in Russia? The right is the ones who want to restore authoritarian communism. Putin then is actually on the far right. The people who wanted markets and democracy, that's the left. That's the ones who were wanting change. They were the liberals in the European, not the American sense. So I think left and right is basically meaningless in the American context. We don't have a left or right because it is jumbled up. Liberal and conservative, maybe those things have meaning, but we're waiting for a realignment of the existing party structures. Josh Hawley has said he really admires Elizabeth Warren. Well, these are two people on the extremes.
Yes.
And so what's happened for Republicans is that they have abandoned the traditional emphasis on protecting economic rights, and they're now going to take economic rights because they know how to improve prosperity.
My impulses and my temperament pull in multiple directions on this personally, because I'm like temperamentally, I'm kind of a no BS Philly kind of guy. Like I don't like this elite nonsense and all this sort of talk of high flying utopian BS. It all sounds like gobbledygook. And so when I encounter the Elizabeth Warren types, I am repulsed. I find somebody that wants to tell other people what to do and has
for their own good. What is wrong with you? It's for their own good.
Yeah.
It's what they would want if they were as smart as she is.
What I want to tell them, I won't say on the show because I try to keep it pretty clean. So, but at the same time, temperamentally, that sort of like punch that's in me butts up against a belief in things that are not popular anymore. Or maybe they're never popular. Free trade, relatively open immigration, relatively speaking, and the sort of classical liberal
low taxes, manageable regulations, for the most part, leave people alone.
Yeah, and I see those as coherent.
There's like 7 of us who still believe in that.
But and it's like, maybe it's because I'm a graybeard now, so it's just like, nah, I'm part of the old guard that'll get washed away by the new thing, I guess. But and yet I do feel like in our politics, the conservative side of the aisle is still more like my people than the progressive side of the aisle. Like I don't see anyone on the the Democrat and adjacent who want bottom-up organization, who want people to have as much say over their own lives as possible, except insofar as they want to give people stuff. This equity talk. Oh, you're behind, I'm going to give you stuff. It's this assumption that what you have is ultimately whatever we've given you. And the problem maybe is that we need to give you more. So I do lean, I'm not like really in the middle. I'm not, I lean to the right, or whatever. But then I run into this buzzsaw where you got, again, like J.D. Vance to me is actually more of a progressive than even Donald Trump in terms of his posture. He's got this sort of, fake populism, but it's like populism filtered through Silicon Valley. And I don't like that. I think that's a mistake. I don't think that's going to help workers. I don't think that's going to help anybody. Where does that leave me? I mean, where do we go from here? It's like, oh, no, you're just a weirdo.
Politics is dialectic. And so the strengths of a position pushed too far become weaknesses. That weakness then is perceived by people who want to try to get power. And so this will elicit a response. And so I think already we're seeing the shrinking of progressive wokeism as a viable strategy. A lot of people are angry at that. And so a lot of the big moves by Silicon Valley and other large firms towards DEI, they've pulled way back on that because that was an excess. So I think dialectic saves us more because it looks like this can't continue. Well, it won't. That's how dialectics work. The response is going to sweep it back. The question is what's going to happen instead. And that's what worries me as a small c conservative. I want to conserve the liberal tradition that until now has given the U.S. a solid enough foundation that in spite of kind of rocking back and forth, we don't capsize. If the dialectic response that I'm seeing among young people on the left and right is, well, screw this Constitution thing. then we don't have a foundation anymore. And that's sort of entropy, that chaos is the natural state if you don't have good institutions, if you don't have good rules. We've been so lucky, but we've taken it for granted. I don't see us teaching grade school children the U.S. is really awesome. The U.S. is the greatest country the world has ever known. It has produced more liberty, prosperity. It is a beacon for the entire world. We're talking about building a wall, but it's to keep people out. It's not to keep people in. It was keeping people in that many countries have built walls for. The reason we have thought about building a wall is that so many people want to come to the U.S. We're having trouble managing it.
This has always been this thing that, or maybe it hasn't always been, but it is certainly a thing right now that I find so hilarious, is you have in these academic circles especially, and the whacked out radical left-wing progressive people, the BLM types and the
those are progressive,
Antifas,
not left. So
yeah, whatever you want to call them, these burn it all down people.
Mm-hmm.
There's a new trailer out for this Matt Walsh film, and it's the title's like Am I a Racist? And in it there's a I think this is from this like grift called Race to Dinner, where a bunch of like wine drinking white ladies hire these two progressives to come and berate them for an evening. And I mean, they're just bad. They're just like, this country's trash. It's the worst thing in the world. And it's like, how has that been mainstreamed? Where it used to be, if you called somebody a America hater, or that they weren't patriotic. I mean, you just go back to the before times of the 90s. I'm a Gen Xer, so the 90s were the high point. But I think the 90s might have actually been a high point. It doesn't matter how much of a doctrinaire sort of liberal Democrat or whatever. If you question someone's patriotism, they pushed back at you hard.
Well, many liberal Democrats they'd been in the military. They actually had sacrificed things for the U.S. The distinction that I would make is between nationalism and patriotism. A nationalist is someone who believes in their country no matter what. A patriot is someone who believes that their country should live up to its promise, and they try to make that happen. We have a third group now that just hates the United States.
Yeah.
And I have had people tell me with a straight face, even at Duke, I laud Duke, but they'll say it is a microaggression. It is a racist act to say that the U.S. is a great country, because it is a racist country and we have to burn down all of these institutions. And no country can survive if its elites believe that.
We are coming up on the 250th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence in 2026. When you go back, we're talking about like the liberalism of America, and it's not political liberalism as most people think, that like extreme Democrat or whatever. It's the liberalism of having an open society that is maximizing individual liberty, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Those are the liberal ends, right? What were the founders looking to and worrying about? What was informing this group of largely men, overwhelmingly men, that fed into the design of our constitutional republic? Because I know they were looking to Greece. That, you go to Washington, D.C., and there's all this sort of like Greco-Roman architecture. There was I understand that George Washington was putting on like the play Cato with the troops during the Revolutionary War. So what take me back there and capture for me the concerns and the vision and the inputs into the founding.
They were coming from a setting where they had felt that there was excessive power concentrated in the person of the king. And they felt, and that uniquely, England had this tradition that had come from 1210, 1215, and the signing of the Magna Carta. Now, the Magna Carta was an agreement at Runnymede between the king and a few nobles. Nobody really cares about the common people here. But there's a phrase in it where, in the Magna Carta, in 1215, that says that freemen will not be denied their rights as Englishmen without due process. And that became a thing. Now, it became often honored in the breach, but having those words written down really mattered. So in the 1680s, Sir Edward Coke, famously in Parliament, was complaining about something that the king had done, and he said, "The Magna Carta is such a fellow as will have no sovereign." What he meant by that is that the king is under the rule of law. The king doesn't get to decide what the rules are. The rules tell the king what the king, even the king, what the king can do. And so England had this tyrannical system, but it also had the Magna Carta. And so one big tradition, and this was actually, if you read the Declaration of Independence, it happened several times. The king has denied us our rights as Englishmen. Now, for them, the colonies to think they had rights as Englishmen was kind of weird, but all of the charters said that they did. So the state charters said they had the rights of Englishmen. So that a big one was their invocation of the due process rights as Englishmen in the Magna Carta. A second was the tradition of Greek and Roman republics. And Plato's book is not called The Democracy. He thought democracy was terrible. And he talks about democracy being, it's as if you've had your cellar is being watched by worthless butlers who drink all of your wine. And if you try to admonish them, they'll revolt. They're constantly in chaos. Democracy's terrible. What we need is a republic. Rome, if you look at the Roman historical writers talking about the republic period before the empire's bad, how can we maintain the republic? So those were the big inputs. But there's one that I think we often miss. John Locke, of course, in his Life, Liberty, and Property, which became Life, Liberty, and the Pursuit of Happiness. That's in the Declaration of Independence. But many of the founders in their writing talked about Montesquieu. And I think we don't emphasize Montesquieu enough. Montesquieu, in the spirit of law, has this wonderful framing of why it is we want liberty. And I think I would say that's the single most important touchstone for us understanding today how the founders thought of liberty. Montesquieu said, why do we want liberty? Why do we want liberty in a society? And the answer is, I'm getting goosebumps just saying this. The reason we want liberty in a society is so that we are free to do what we ought to will.
We are free to do what we ought to will.
What we ought to will.
Expand that.
So it's not we're free to do whatever we want. There are a set of rules that have come down to us from the cultural and I'll say it, religious traditions of the past that should guide our behavior. But acts to be salvatory have to be authentic and voluntary. Having a set of rules that saying this is how you have to act, that's not salvatory. That's not the way to salvation. The way to salvation is to have us think, reflect, and choose the right thing to do, to cultivate characters of virtue in the Aristotelian sense. Character of virtue, all characters are composed of virtues and vices, but they're habits that are acquired over time. So I think, how am I going to act? And I have guides from this. I don't design my own character. I read the great works of Scripture, and those are the guide to what virtue is. So the founders, almost to a person, thought that the tradition of religious virtue is what would guide what people ought to will. And so the government shouldn't be telling them what to do, but it's only because they're going to do the right thing if they have the freedom to go to their church, to go to their associations, to come up with these emergent institutions. And that's what government has to leave alone. And Tocqueville was terrified in 1830. He thought France, because it was much more of a democracy, would enfeeble these, and that was the word that he used in French, will enfeeble these associational impulses. And so the reason we have liberty is to do what we ought to will. This, if we go forward 250 years, the reason we have freedom is to do what we want. That's wrong. That was never a part of the American experiment.
I really want to linger on this because I want to make sure I'm understanding the words because it's dense. Ought to will. So ought is a judgment call. The good, the correct, right? And will would be what? To desire, to...
What you want.
So, free. So that is a definition of freedom that from...
It's a justification of freedom. The justification of freedom is to create a setting where each of us is free to do what we ought to want to do, not what we want to do. And we're not being forced to do something we ought not do.
So it sounds paradoxical to a modern ear, right? That, well, and I've encountered this. Where I've encountered this, not in this formula, is I've spent this past year going with my son, as we were talking about over dinner last night, to essentially the Catholic sort of preparation for confirmation, because he didn't go to Catholic school, so he didn't get theology class all along the way. And so I said, hey, before you leave, I want to have you finish this thing that we started with your baptism.
Who's the onboarding process, the rite of Christian initiation of adults.
So it's like, okay, so we're going to do these things. And it was basically, it was like I was back in theology class, and one of the classes was about, moral choice, and the deacon who was teaching it said something incredibly similar, like freedom as Catholics understand it is the freedom to do what's right. And I raised my hand and I'm like, well, wait a second now. But doesn't that, but A, it presumes you know what's right. B, sometimes there's multiple choices. But also, like, isn't the semantic definition of freedom the freedom just to be able to make choices? So that, like, it sounds like you're saying you don't really have freedom. You can choose good, and that's a free choice, or you can choose bad, and that's not really a free choice. Is that not the right way to hear this?
You don't even need me here. You could just be doing this on your own. Because like you said, that sounds weird to the modern ear. But remember, your question was, what did the founders think? And what the founders thought is what we're talking about. They actually believed that the context in which our views about right and wrong, the way that we're brought up, often in a church, but certainly the moral and character training we receive from our parents, those things tell us what right and wrong are. The government cannot be in charge of those things. And so we're going to have freedom. Now, the freedom to do the right thing entails, logically, the freedom to do the wrong thing. And we don't want people to do that. And it's so tempting then, and my friend Patrick Deneen at Notre Dame has gone, and he has a book in 2018, The Failure of Liberalism, where he says what liberalism has become, and this is your modern ear, what liberalism has become is a claim that anything that is not illegal is okay. And not many things are illegal. You can do anything that you want. You can do the drag queen in libraries thing, go nuts. It's all literally equally okay. That's not what liberalism was, but it is to some extent. I've actually come a long way in Patrick's direction here. At first I heard that, no, that's not what liberalism is. Liberalism is the claim that government should be restricted so that people can create their own way, their own pursuit of happiness. I get to define what my own ends are, and we have to rely on people to choose good ones. It's true that some people are going to choose bad ones, but the fact that people get to choose good ones and to realize good, laudable, moral goals, that's the essential thing. And what Patrick Deneen says, and I'm afraid he's right, is that it's become something else. It just means that you can do whatever you want.
To come back to the sort of founding context, you have a group of men who are Englishmen, who are of a tradition that believed that there was rights that you had as an individual that were not grants from the king, but that even the king was subordinate to them.
Yeah.
And by and large, they all also believed some more structured than others, that essentially those were endowed by the Creator, as the Declaration declares, that these were actually natural rights. These are inherent in the nature of the kind of thing we are as a person.
They pre-exist the construction of government. Government is contingent on that. So government is chosen by the people to secure those rights.
And so out of that comes that plus a kind of distrust for a kind of purely populistic democracy, sort of two wolves and a sheep voting on who to have for dinner, the public purse turning into a public trough. They said about designing a bunch of stuff and putting it down. So pencil sketch what that is supposed to look like, because some of it's also been dismantled. But, what was the original thing that they were aiming to do with the way they structured the American system?
Again, my hero, Montesquieu, comes to the fore, because Montesquieu was a big fan. I think if you're French, you're going to admire a bunch of other governments, because the French government in the 18th century was not very good. But he was a big fan of the English
Hasn't gotten much better.
He was a big fan of the British system of government because he saw it as having checks and balances. And so famously, England and France were engaged in this contest over who could build the most capital ships. So a ship of the line was the coin, what you needed to engage in big naval battles. France had a terrible time borrowing because its king was too powerful. Its king would say, we're going to borrow money from all you nobles. I'll pay it back, I promise. And we'll use it to build ships. And the nobles say, man, I checked my pockets. I got nothing. Because if the king takes your money and builds ships, he'll say, I was thinking, I'm not going to pay you back. And there's nobody that can tell him he has to. England was more powerful because the king was weaker. Let me say that again. England was more powerful. The government of England was more powerful because the king was weaker. The parliament and the debts were actually guaranteed by the British system of government. England had an easy time borrowing. And the Dutch were just whores. They would loan money to anybody. They didn't care as long as they were going to get paid back. But the Dutch were loaning money like crazy to the English at really low interest rates. And so England becomes this big naval power, not because they were better at having navies, because they had a better system of government, because it had embodied Montesquieu's system of checks and balances. So checks and balances were what that is the blueprint for the American Constitution. And there's two sets of them. One is horizontal, separation of powers, and the other is vertical, the division of powers among federal and states. So federalism is one system, and then the separation of powers, where you've got these different magistracies or activities that ambition is going to be made to counteract ambition. If I'm a member of the Supreme Court and I see the president trying to become too powerful, I say, I don't think so. Not because I love the people, but because I love me. I love being on the Supreme Court. I walk down the street, I've got this black robe, I'm looking bitchin'. People say, look at that guy. He's got that great robe on. Well, it's because the Supreme Court is powerful. But my power depends on me standing up to the power grabs of the president. We can rely on this conflict of self-interest to guarantee the freedom of the people. So Montesquieu's separation of powers, the same thing that allowed England to buy ships, and France had a terrible time buying ships. So it wasn't military power, it was how good the government was. The U.S. has two kinds of checks and balances. One is horizontal and the other is vertical. That's what they were going for. We have largely seen the evisceration of federalism. The state power really no longer exists. The federal government can regulate anything that it wants.
I have said in prior videos and elsewhere that the Dobbs decision, which overturned Roe versus Wade and effectively said there is, as of today, no federal policy in place for abortion access or legality.
There never should have been. It was police power all along.
So it has been returned to the states. And so this is just saying federalism good. I think we should Dobbs the hell out of everything. If you don't like the rules in Texas, you can vote with your feet. and that is more likely to preserve the United States, in my opinion, as a single nation, which we should want, because we got a lot of good stuff like protection from oceans on both sides. That is a path to sort of de-escalating this strife that comes about surrounding our federal power and our politics. And, I got to vote for the lesser of two evils, and I got to get all upset because Kamala Harris is going to be a cackling dictator, or Donald Trump is going to be a neo-Hitlerian fascist. It's like, nah, actually, they're not going to be able to have that much of an impact on my life, because most of the decisions are actually in the state I live in, and even better, all the way down to me. Like most of my choices are up to me. Is it as bad as you made it out? Is it really the case that federalism is dead, or is it on the rise?
I'm willing to believe that there are dialectics there also, and that the centralization was too much. I think regardless of what you think about the abortion question, Roe versus Wade was a terrible decision. The way that it was written had no constitutional basis. And so when Dobbs was decided and people said, well, this is overturning the Constitution. No, it's actually overturning another Supreme Court decision. Surely the Supreme Court can overturn its own decisions. And so the Dobbs decision, whatever you think of it on the merits, and I actually have some sympathy for the fact that it is wrenching to have such a big change. I live in a state and I no longer have a right that I used to have if I'm a woman. It's hard to say, well, you have to move, but federalism, if it's stable, if we don't get these wrenching changes because the Supreme Court is changing like a weather vane, if federalism is stable, then people are going to choose a set of people who are closer to what they want in tax policy, regulation. So the genius of federalism is just what you say. We can move around and we can also do experiments. And so it's very upsetting to New York and California that a whole bunch of their best people are moving to Texas and Florida. And the reason that they're doing that is that in some ways those systems are more attractive. And so having that sort of competitive pressure about how much regulation, how much tax, how much tyranny the government can exercise, that gives you a check. The right of exit always gives you a check on the tyrannical nature of government.
It's interesting to think about when you think about this, the notions of freedom and of power. Who has power? We talk about progressives have long said, we need to counter the robber baron and the corporate power.
Yeah, concentrated power. We need to put a thumb on the scale to equalize it.
And so they turn to the government and say, this is the only entity that can possibly stand up to corporate power. This is, again, where I think the left-right stuff gets all jumbled now, because you have the J.D. Vances and the Josh Hawleys of the world looking at quite powerful companies like Google and saying, yes, we need the FTC to come in. We just have to make sure that it's coming in for the good stuff and pushing them towards what we like. But even just a recent example, as of this week, maybe they will change it because Elon's tweeting. If you started to type assassination of Don, like there's no autocomplete. You can type full on assassination of Donald Trump and there's no autocomplete in the Google search bar. You'll get everybody but that. Assassination of Trump, assassination of Donald Trump. It's like being memory holed by the most powerful website in the world. In this thing that, if you hit enter, it'll deliver search results. But that impression reaches just about everybody. And so, people on the political right are saying, look at this. This is a natural monopoly. We do need to use the state to tell Google you can't do that. You can't essentially meddle in elections by having whatever sort of woke employees are messing around with your algorithm do this stuff. This is unacceptable. Now, the doctrinaire libertarian turns around and says, well, that's a private enterprise. It should do it at once.
Well, it actually has the moral right to do what it wants, and that's why no one listens to libertarians, because they're arguing that it is the moral right of private companies to act as they will with their own resources. That's basically completely unpersuasive. I have an alternative, which I call the Munger test.
Please.
I immodestly call it the Munger test.
Yes.
So I have many friends on the left and the right that will say, I think the state should be in charge of something. And so I say, well, when you say that, I want you to take out the word state and put in Nancy Pelosi. I think Nancy Pelosi should be in charge of deciding what companies can do, or Donald Trump. I'm not trying to make a partisan point. Mm-hmm. And they usually back off. They imagine that there's this entity called the state, which wants what is good for them. It's actually politics. There's no such thing as the state. So I think that what is difficult for those of us who have been raised in a setting where we're sort of implicitly being told to trust these authorities. And these authorities told us, for example, Joe Biden is sharp as a tack. Up until the day...
Don't believe your lying eyes. He's great.
They started telling us...
Sharp.
Kamala Harris is really awesome. Well, I don't know what to believe. So what we've seen, and then during COVID, we have medical authorities telling that this was true. And then before long, no, we've always been at war with Oceania. You never were supposed to wear gloves or wipe things off. This is airborne transmission. You can't devalue expertise, the authority of expertise, and expect people to continue to respect you. So the place of science and authority in the U.S. has really fallen. And this is another element of what we were talking about before, the destruction of the power of elites. But I don't know if you remember in Gone with the Wind.
It's been a while, but
so they're going to leave Atlanta, and Scarlett is trying to lock the door. And Rhett Butler is waiting for her in the wagon, and he bursts out laughing. Oh, that's great. You're going to lock out the Yankees. So this other army is coming in, but she locks the door before she leaves. She says, I don't care. The Yankees can come and take it all. I hate the Confederacy. And they see these Confederate troops marching out. And she says, good, I'm glad they're leaving. And Rhett, who's a sensible person of the world, says, I wouldn't be too much of a hurry to see them leave. With them leaves the last semblance of order. And so if you destroy elites, if we allow elites to destroy themselves, what replaces that is not what I want. It's not what Josh Hawley wants. It's not what J.D. Vance wants. It's chaos. It's just open warfare. If you don't have authority, then you're going to end up with the imposition of some sort of authority that's going to be much worse. So I want to make a 1.5 cheers out of 3 for elites. It's like the Confederates. Yeah, they suck, but you don't really want them to march out and leave, because what's going to happen instead? And in the movie, people were throwing chairs. They're starting to loot, because the absence of authority brings chaos.
This is the most challenging thing, I think, for our moment. Well, there's a lot. For me, at least, this tension, because you have this structure, as we've described, this set of Englishmen embedded in essentially a Christian ethos. And that is saying, oh, no, there is a vision of the good. It is fundamentally a Christian vision of the good, and what good behavior is, and why I should love thy neighbor as thyself, because we have equal dignity. And so we have equal rights as a human because we have a soul from our Creator. That is the starting point. Not because I'm stronger than you and therefore better, which is like the way it's always been until then.
We have a set of rules of propriety and forbearance that will guide us.
And so they build this imperfect but quite magnificent structure of constitutional order that is the United States. And here we are. It is improved in many ways, and it is degraded in many ways. It improved with the end of slavery. It is degraded with the destruction of these things that break the rule, the separations of power. So now basically we get these wild swings. There's a lot about the elite that I kind of want to smash. So that makes me feel like, whose side am I on there when I want to smash it? Because, when Donald Trump says, like, the deep state's a bunch of crooks, it's like, oh, yeah, they're a bunch of crooks. They're clearly a bunch of crooks.
Not all. There's a bunch of people who deeply care about the country. They're working hard. As a whole, the deep state is terrible.
So that makes me feel like I'm in Molotov cocktail territory temperamentally. I'm not saying I am, just saying the impulse to say this has gotten way out of hand.
And you're more sensible than most people because you're saying, and then what? Many people just say, this is our enemy, we must destroy our enemy. And then somehow, the day after that, I don't know how, something good is going to happen. It's not. If authority leaves, you don't replace it with some other authority. We got so lucky to have the institutional structure that we have. We have to stick with it. We have to patch it together and try to move it back in the direction that allowed it to function. So I think that the desire to smash the elites is understandable, but we have to not do that because the result would be much, if we succeed, if you actually succeed in this, it will be much worse. The day after that will be much worse.
So, and there's a bunch of places my thinking goes here that I'm trying to sort out in real time. But the one place that I come to is that we aren't all similar as a people. There are actual sociopaths in the mix. There's some percentage of people who are, it's a small percentage, but who are have a disproportionate impact on the rest of us. And I think that's where the notion of like having police comes in. Like, oh, if we can just lock up the people who really are sociopaths, it's not like their share of the total will be spread evenly. It's like, no, we're monumentally better. If we can take out like the bottom 5% who really are like lunatics, put them in jail, we get a 10x benefit in order, in opportunity, in freedom, and in goodness, whatever. There's a kind of nonlinearity, a kind of like disproportionality going on there. And I don't know what it is exactly, but it's not zero. Like you take away order and you let what will happen. It's like Hayek wrote about why the worst get on top. If you can't take the wannabe Stalins and throat slitters and put them behind bars, your throat will be the one that they get. But there's some other force happening, it feels like to me. And your world in academia seems to be an example of this, maybe the most important one, or something. This like battle of ideas that you're talking about, this like muddling through to try to preserve the best of what we've got that we kind of lucked into by history. When suddenly all of the elite institutions are utterly dominated by the People's Republic of stuff types. There is no dialectic anymore there, right? When it's literally like you go to a humanities department and you won't find one person that knows anyone that's a Republican. Something's happened that doesn't seem like it's like a category change has taken place. Am I making sense?
Sure.
So what do we do about when institutions become like they shift to not just being like qualitatively different, but or maybe not quantitative. I don't know if it's qual or quant, but they're now a different thing. It's now just a fifth column for radical nihilism. It's not the competition of ideas. It's dead.
I'm very optimistic about this, and here's why.
Okay.
It's because there's a bunch of people who are paying a buttload of money to be at these elite institutions. Some semesters, I teach more students total than the entire history department because I'll have a class of 100 and a class of 50, and the history department is teaching courses where 4 or 5 people take a class about an illiterate slave woman who communicated some things via oral history, because their job in social history is, and I don't have a problem with this on research, but they're teaching classes not about this is the history of the United States. This was letters written by someone who knew this woman. Nobody's going to take those classes. I'm teaching an introduction to political economy and saying this is the structure of economics and political institutions that produce liberty and prosperity, and students are hungry for that. So the universities are finding out that they're more of a consumer-driven business than you might expect. There was a time when a lot of the curriculum was driven by faculty, but faculty, like many authorities, have proven themselves unworthy of the responsibility conferred on them. And so as a result, these departments are shrinking like crazy. So the humanities departments that you're worried about, there is a dialectic. They're shrinking like crazies. The history, English, literature, the various departments of indignation studies, they're half the size that they were. And the departments of computer science, economics, biology, they're growing. And they tend to be growing with people who are not ideologically doctrinaire. They're trying to provide, because the money is talk. Money talks. It costs $70,000 a year to go to Duke. Now,
Shocking.
Maybe
crazy.
Maybe people
Sounds
don't
crazy.
want to pay that, but if people do want to pay it, they also ought to have some say in what's being taught. And so you look at board of trustees, you look at presidents. University of North Carolina near me has just created a new separate school that is about discourse and liberal arts. And it was a kind of takeover, and the faculty complained, nobody cares, because taxpayers, for the state schools, taxpayers are the real constituents, and for the private schools, students are the real constituents. And so I think that within 5 years, we're going to see very substantial changes at most of the universities, except the very elite that have so much money in their endowment that they're insulated from these dialectical forces.
That's really positive to hear. That is not a typical story being told out there right now.
Because it's hard to do fundraising by saying the system is working. You want to do fundraising by saying,
We're all doomed.
The world is
We're all
going to
doomed.
end, give me money. And so these fundraisers, in my mind, are behaving badly by ignoring the fact that the system is changing in the way that it should.
There is this flip side story about the consumerification of higher ed, which says that we have a very lopsided, broken feedback loop here in which the federal government backstops and subsidizes me to take out massive loans, which is what has been captured by the universities to build lazy rivers and lazy departments. And I get to swim around in the actual lazy river and in the toxic, blood-soaked wasteland of Marxist commune gobbledygook. And I'll pay it back, or it'll get forgiven or something. I don't know, but I'm not having to pay for it right now, so good for me. And so out of that, you have a couple other forces at work. You have a psychologically damaged young generation that's been fed victimology since the early grades, because their teachers are the same people that came out of these crackpot institutions. And so they're actually coming in demanding craziness. So the consumer demand has been shaped. It's a kind of almost manufactured consent kind of story. Is that not true?
You're right. I got nothing. On that score, you're right. So the ideological hegemony of the left, I'm not worried about. I am worried about Jonathan Haidt's anxious generation. I am worried about the consumerification of, because I am an elitist on some level. I think if I'm going to be a college professor and stand in front of a class, I know more than they know, and I should know what they need to know. And if they disagree, they are mistaken.
Fair enough.
It is my responsibility as an educator to be an expert on what it is that they need to know. And they think they want to know something else. This is not going to work. But if it is consumerification, and we saw this in the sort of relevance movement in the 1960s, where classes were professors abdicated their responsibility to be an elite and to say, this is what you need to know. But it didn't actually last very long. So many young people, well, let me put it this way. When someone reads that, when someone reads Plato's Republic, their life is changed. And they say, damn, I didn't realize. This is really cool. Our ideas, our sources are better. If we can just put the hay out there, the goats will eat it. And so the reason that I think consumerification won't be so bad is students come in, they think they know what they want. If I can just get a few of them to read these classic texts, they say, I see, that's what I want.
There is this tendency. It's the sort of the year zero tendency. And maybe it's certainly a function of youth. I want to forge my own path as a young person. We have a negativity bias, so we look around the world and we see problems. We don't see the fact that every single aspect of our life would look like an absolute miracle to someone from 1930 or even 50 or even 60 or 70. It's like, how many people had air conditioning in the 1970s in America?
I grew up in Florida and we did not.
And that's like today, the notion that today it's
not
like
possible. You can't live like that.
It'd be like, no, the air conditioning is a human right. That is like a thing that is like an assumption.
My father was born in 1919 in upstate New York. It was way up the Mohawk Valley. Most of the Depression, they lived in a barn that was essentially unheated. He had to walk 2 miles to go to school. They didn't have a car. His father was largely unemployed. They didn't have electricity, and the toilet was outside. And this was not that long ago. This was my father. And the expectations that people have today about what their life is going to be, they're saying it's not going to be better than my parents. The increment to my parents, to me, to my kids, if we just stay there, that's fine. But you're right. We think about, well, it could be even better. Yeah. And since it's not better, we need to do something.
Yeah. I am born into the world where I already have ubiquitous internet access, anything I want from any screen on multiple devices in my home, in my life. I can connect to anyone instantaneously at any time in multiple time zones, all that stuff. And so, well, where's the problem? Well, the problem is it's not utopia. And so we got to attack that stuff that's not utopia. And all these old people that are living high on the hog, and they don't know what they're talking about. And they're the ones that delivered all the brokenness I'm seeing. So fist in the air, burn it all down.
It's much more fun. I growing up in the 60s, because I'm old, it's way more fun. Instead of these things are basically okay, I'm just going to work. Instead of working, you go talk to attractive members of the opposite sex and describe how the world is going to be better once you create it. And here's what we're going to do.
The flip side of that impulse, I think you and I both find the Antifa burn it all down folks to be gross, because they are, and they're destructive. But there is that same energy is like, I think maybe literally the same energy that is at work in Steve Jobs and Steve Wozniak in their garage saying, we're going to take on IBM and Hewlett Packard.
The elites. We're going to take on the elites. We're
not going to stop them. We're going to put a computer in every home. We're going to make the world a better place. Like Steve Jobs goes to John Scully at Pepsi and is like, do you want to keep selling sugar water? Or do you want to change the world, man? It is the same thing, that entrepreneurial desire to improve things, right?
To understand and to improve things, yes. I can see this new thing. I've been reading the book Dealers in Lightning about Xerox PARC. So Xerox basically invented the personal computer, but the idiots at the top of Xerox, so nobody's ever going to use that. And so other companies took that and thank you very much and made personal computers. So the people who worked at PARC, so the Palo Alto Research Center, They were given freedom to create this, and they were going to burn down the world, and they did. So it is the same thing. You're right to say it's the same energy. But that's the hopeful part. I'm sorry to keep being hopeful and rain on your gray parade.
We need it. We need the hope.
Children want that. Children want a positive, optimistic vision of the future. And the fact that we have insisted on giving them this terrible vision and saying you should be really worried, that's what's resulted in the anxious generation. We can see that's a really bad idea. Let's go back to a positive, optimistic vision of the future. You have to figure out how you can find new ways to serve other people. And if you do that, you will be fabulously rich.
There is a interesting set of dynamics taking place, it seems like to me, with my son's generation, with Gen Z, which is that those same tools and forces, social media, overprotective parenting, pressure to get into a brand name university like Duke, no offense, has given rise to this anxiety. But they're also really savvy. Like a lot of them, maybe most of them, they sort of sniff out BS. We got dinner last night with Lisa and Mateo, and at one point he called me out saying like, that's a bunch of whataboutism. He's well attuned, and I think he's an exemplar of his generation. They can tell, oh, that's just propaganda, and they laugh at it and they memify it. That strikes me as pretty great. That feels like part of the optimism. You're dealing with, as a professor, this successive waves of incoming young people fresh out of high school and where their heads are at. Stay in the optimism. Give me some hope for the kids that you're seeing come into Duke.
They're tremendous. They are worried about the world. They've worried about the legacy that has been left to them. But if you say, here, read this. This is something for the past 2,500 years, people have read to learn about how they should think about the world and their place in society. They read it and they come back and they say, you're absolutely right. That's amazing. Give me more. And so I used to try to appeal to students by, if you give high grades and easy, you can get good evaluations. At Duke, and I think at other elite universities, much of what I got was mediocre evaluations, and this class is too easy, he should assign more reading. They're looking for more. And we can attract the people who feel like they're wasting their time in these crappy classes where you call out bullshit. But if you actually challenge them and you take them seriously, now I'm at an elite school. If I tell students, go read this book, they will read the book. That's not the experience most of my colleagues at large state universities have. So I'm spoiled, I'll admit. But still, if it's not happening at the elite universities, we're really screwed. And I think it can happen. So what we need to do is get people into the classrooms that can reintroduce the educational materials that we already know will work, that have stood the test of time. That when people read these, their life is changed. The way they think about their place in the universe is changed.
On one hand, you have, I think, something that could be accessible to everyone, which is like, you can grapple with this and things like this, with the stories and the great books, like the stuff that tried to grapple with the human condition. And because of the way it did it, people still read hundreds and hundreds and hundreds or thousands of years later and say, well, survivalist success, that's pretty good. Should probably read that. Should probably not think I can make this up on my own, ex nihilo. And then there's the other reality of, I need to get a job. I need to be able to navigate a world in which I can afford to live. And these two pursuits, when you're struggling to build a life materially, reading Plato and Montesquieu and stuff like that sounds like a bunch of nonsense. Like, give me a break. I can barely make my mortgage payments, and you're talking to me about how great it is to send my kid off to read Plato with Mike Munger. No way. for the very reasonable concern about just material reality and cost of living and navigating what to do with yourself, how do you connect those dots? Do they matter? Is this for everybody, or is it really like, oh well, it's the clerics, it's the new monastery. There's a handful of sort of future priests who'll go to Duke and read Plato, and for the rest of the plebes, they'll go get a job in construction.
Every generation has the feeling that no one has faced these problems or had these feelings before. And old people look at them and say, oh, I remember feeling that. And the young people say, no, you don't, because no one has ever felt this before. This is the first time in the history of the world. Somehow we have to convey the fact that there are both idiosyncratic and shared elements of the human experience. So a lot of soldiers who come back from the Middle East and are suffering from PTSD and having trouble reacclimating with their family and with society, if they are led through a reading of the Odyssey, which is a story of the hero's journey, and goes through all of these trials and tribulations that are horrible that he can't forget, and then he comes back home, but home is so different that he isn't even recognized. How does he reintegrate himself into this place that he should know well, but he has been changed by the hero's journey? A lot of them are helped a lot by reading the Odyssey. I think that because they recognize there is actually some shared set of fundamental elements of the human experience, and yeah, it's all different. The details are different, but recognizing that I'm part of something larger than myself can make a big difference in saying, people have gone through this a lot. I need to think about how I can work on this instead of, this is the first time it's ever happened, I'm screwed. But we, in the past 20 or 30 years, have validated young people's feelings that this is the first time it's ever, climate change, it's over, you shouldn't have children. So many young people think it's the end of the world. Yeah. It is the eschaton.
False.
Well, it's easy to say false, but we haven't given them a context. I started going
It's not easy to say false. It's easy to say false.
But not persuasively.
But to confront that subject, to take time with it, you will end up saying false if you take it seriously.
Yes.
You will. If you spend a lot of time with that subject.
But they say, it was easy for you. In 1963, we had drills in Florida because we're near Cape Kennedy, where they would launch rockets. We would have to get under our desks in anticipation of a nuclear attack from Cuba, because it wasn't far from Cuba to Orlando, where I grew up.
Yeah.
That's pretty scary. There has always been an eschaton. There has always been an end of the world coming in every generation, but it has never been immanentized. So the eschaton, the end, has been made imminent to young people. It is everywhere. It's all around them, and they accept it. Okay, it's over. I'm not going to have children. I'm not even sure I really should study these great works. What I need to do is try to get a job on Wall Street and make as much money as I can, as quickly as I can, before somebody pulls the plug and the whole system collapses. So the sense that we don't have very long, this millennial, so literally millennials have this millennial sense that the end is coming. And that the educational system has been complicit in that. We need to try to reintegrate to a longer term view. And I don't think it's impossible. I don't think that it's very hard, but I do think that most primary school education doesn't do a very good job of telling people everyone has these feelings. Everyone has this sense of doom. I don't fit in. I'm having trouble making friends. It's okay. You can get through it.
One of the things that is interesting, and I wonder how different it is really, but it feels in some ways profoundly different, is that we, the human animal, haven't changed very much, like physically, biologically. I think psychologically, we haven't changed very much. That I haven't heard anyone make a good argument that we've changed dramatically from, say, 2,500 years ago as a creature.
10,000 years ago.
Like, you know, Homo sapien. Once you're like Homo sapiens and you look like us. Maybe you're a little shorter, but we're basically the same.
That's nutrition.
Yeah.
That's not genetics. That's nutrition.
Just so we haven't changed, but the landscape we're in has changed radically, and the technological landscape feels like it has not only just changed radically, but some of the changes that have happened in my lifetime are of a sort that seems different. So if you say, okay, along comes the replacement of horsepower as in horses with horsepower as in engines and mechanical things, and that's radical transformation. And suddenly you go from half of Americans being farmers to 2% being farmers. So that's a lot.
And more
change.
output.
Yes. And we're all eating better, and nobody, basically, like, a tiny handful of farmers feed the entire planet of the earth with surplus. We throw away 40% of our food. That's a crazy change, but it's material. It's physical. I can get it. I can get, like, oh yeah, there's that tractor. Like, it's picking up a lot more wheat than I can with my bare hands. The information tsunami, the digital information, the sort of avatar identity, the stuff that constitutes the stuff that our kids are growing up in, feels like a very different kind of change. Do you feel like that has set us up for a this time is different kind of set of potential problems? Like, is it like what our kids are facing now, and the students that are coming into your classroom, they are facing a very different grappling with the future than the past doomsdayers? And, like, you know, you're seeing it. You couldn't doom scroll in 1970. You can doom scroll all the time in 2024. How do you think about that?
Friedrich Hayek has, in a couple of his books, a discussion of what he calls atavisms. So atavisms are biological anachronisms that persist long after their function no longer is important. So whales, strangely, have hips. They don't have legs. But whales once were land mammals who went back into the water. That's how they started to breathe instead of having gills. So there are a bunch of muscle groups that attach to these hip bones. And so the legs just held them back. It made them slower. So evolution got rid of that. It selected for animals that didn't have external back legs. But there was no evolutionary force that got rid of the hips. And so if you look at a whale skeleton, it's just bizarre. There's these rudimentary hips that have absolutely no function.
It's vestigial.
Hayek wondered if some of the moral brain architecture that we have about reacting to things also could be atavistic. And so, for example, the way that I think about price gouging, the use of prices to allocate scarce resources in an emergency.
Yeah.
I have this feeling that people should give me stuff if I need it. But we're actually better off in most circumstances if there's a high elasticity, that is responsiveness of price. We can get more stuff here faster if we allow the price mechanism to work. And so people's opposition to markets, to price system, to investment, all of the things that you mentioned as having produced this big increase in productivity and prosperity, we also have a moral feeling that it's wrong.
So to concretize that, you are in, say, Louisiana, and you're in a hurricane comes sweeping through New Orleans, and sure enough, those generators sitting on the shelf at Walmart go from being worth $2.99 to being worth whatever you are willing to pay.
Probably $2,000. Close to 10 times increase.
So the prices are bid up by people saying, "No, I'll take it for $2,000 because I'm administrator at a hospital and I can pay the $2,000." And in come the politicians and the public.
Absolutely,
we the people.
Absolutely, the public.
We the people says you're price gouging. They are. you're a jerk.
Yeah.
You're ripping people off. Government, please stop that. And as a result, all the surrounding people and all the other states that have generators they could send for $2,000.
They would be happy to. They would find a way.
They're like, I'm going to drop everything and start.
I'm going to rent a truck.
They don't do that in the absence of it. So you've got this.
Desperately needed generators do not move to their higher valued use.
So you feel all good and pious that you said, oh, I fought those price gouging crooked capitalists, and meanwhile you starved people who otherwise would have gotten more things were it not for your
They
piousness.
themselves wanted it. It's not that they wanted the generators and you were preventing it. They themselves wanted those price gouging laws enforced.
Right. So we've got some vestigial hips in our brain that says, that's not fair. You have too many berries. I don't have enough. There's only so many berries to go around.
We should share. Over the last 30 years or so, the rapidity of change has accelerated. So this happened since the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. We've had trouble adjusting our mental models to understand the value of capitalism and market processes. They're not perfect. There's a bunch of problems with them, but that's where you get the hockey stick. So Deirdre McCloskey talks about the Great Enrichment. It happened at a point where you started to get the acceptance of market institutions. We now are in the middle of what I called in my book, Tomorrow 3.0, the third great economic transformation. The first was the Neolithic, the move to fixed agriculture. The second was the industrial. This one is different. I think it is different. And I am not optimistic. I'm optimistic about a lot of things, but I am not optimistic about the ability of our brain architecture to be able to update the way that we understand the position we are in the world. It used to be that I've had a bunch of people tell me this. I'll say, kids today have a problem because we don't let them free range. They don't ride their bikes to school. They don't have any opportunity to take responsibility. They're constantly being watched. And so the person I'm talking to happened to be a woman who lived in my neighborhood, said, oh, but you read about all these kidnappings. Yet literally none of them are in our town. Most of them are not in our state. But every day you read about dozens of kidnappings in a country of 300 million people. But that's not the way our brain works. Our assessment of risk is if we hear about it, it must be bad because we live in a small rural group of 150 people.
Dunbar's number. If
I hear of this and size of the group is limited by Dunbar's number, that's dangerous. So my response is, that's dangerous. So I think this is going to be a really terrible problem. We are not able to update our visceral whale hips reaction to statements about risk. And demagogues can always say, oh, you should just be huddled in your house in helpless fear, vote for me.
The safety concern is the most visceral. And it's also the one that's like that one in particular. It's like not only were there no kidnappings in her town, your town, but actually all the kidnappings, if you dig below the surface, more or less
family members.
It's marital disputes. Yep. It's not even that, it's the creepos with the white unmarked van snatching your kids. It's like your soon to be ex-husband or wife who is getting screwed by the family courts. And it's like, I'm taking my kids. Yeah. Like, it's not that it's zero. There are some creepos in vans and there are some acts of sheer depravity, but you are more likely to get struck by two different lightning bolts at the same time than have that happen to your kids.
So this example is, we shouldn't focus too much on. The point is that the way that our brain works is evolved for a time when we're living in groups of 150. The human reproductive cycle is not fast enough that evolution has taken us much beyond that. So it's called the Stone Age mind hypothesis. It means that we're evolved for living 10,000 years ago. Now, we have certain rational ability to understand our context that can progress much faster than that. But there's still a drag, this emotional, atavistic, And you can understand why it's really important. If you didn't care about risk, you died. You were selected out. And so this deep caring about risk, worrying about risk for your children, it was something that was evolutionarily adaptive. Now it is going to be more and more of a problem as we see the accelerating rate of change. I don't know what's going to happen.
This is one of the things that has started to change where I spend my energy. As a parent, it's one of the things that underpins why this show exists, is that there does seem to be the paradox that we live in the best material time ever. And there is,
away.
By far, like, it's a fact. Like, you don't want to be born, even in 1980. It's like, you want to be born now. Now's great. And it's also not that great because there's all these people suffering. We have an opioid crisis, the likes of which is true. I mean, it really is, I hate to say crisis, except that is a crisis.
The numbers, it's a crisis.
The numbers are catastrophic. You have the mental health collapse that's taking place. And it's like, it feels like there's something happening, like there's an asymptotic line. We've been on this slide and here we go. And it's like,
So you're coming close to using the word singularity, and it might be a singularity. It might be that the rate of change becomes fast enough that it becomes qualitatively different. It's no longer a rate of change, but a jump to something else, the nature of which we cannot perceive, much less predict and prepare for.
Yeah, I mean, we're obviously in 2024. We are a couple years into this generative AI revolution. You know, you were saying over dinner how you don't have the kids do papers anymore, right? Well, talk about that, because I think like this is a microcosmic example of a way you've adapted to some of the things that are taking place.
I wrote a controversial little piece in which I argued that we should think of ChatGPT as a calculator, because when I was growing up, there was a debate about whether students needed to learn how to do long division. If they used a calculator, they'd never develop their brains. Well, on a much larger level, times 1,000, if people don't learn how to write, will they even really learn how to speak? I think ChatGPT is a calculator in the sense that if I learn how to use ChatGPT, it's going to make me a much better writer, because I can get a first draft very quickly and then edit it. My job is to produce content that's useful to someone else. So I have abandoned the use of papers. I'm not sure papers were ever a good idea. Professors would
And you mean, and here we're talking about like student has to write a paper on subject X.
30-page research paper with footnotes. Basically, it's because professors are pathetic and desire their students to validate their sad little lives. So we need students to act as
Not wrong about that.
We want students to do what we do so that we can feel superior and say, you're not very good at this. Well, they don't want to be good at this. Why would you want to write a 30-page research paper? That's not a skill that ever mattered for anyone, really. What we need to do is produce content. So I'm trying to get students to produce 5-minute, 7-minute, 20-minute videos that are well-produced, that have good production values. That used to be hard. You know better than anyone, that used to be hard.
Yeah,
there's a bunch of tools in the last 5 years. It's not that hard.
You got a whole studio in your pocket. It's like
it's a calculator. It's just a
incredible.
really, really good calculator. So what we need to do is teach students how to use these tools, not to be terrified and intimidated by them.
This question of what are the foundational things to hold on to? You know, so underneath the surface of that, like, what would you say is the lesson there that is applicable beyond? Now I've honed some video skills or whatever. Why are you doing that? What is it that your students are learning that will go with them? And it's not one thing, but from your perspective, like, why do that?
I use the word content advisedly. So content is something that other people can use, look at, listen to, see, that conveys something. So it really is a problem of am I able to communicate along all of the myriad new avenues that have come about just in the last few years? And if I start thinking of it in terms of content, I'll be better able to do it. But I still need to have some content to the content. And that's why I want them to use ChatGPT and to read Plato. We have to do both things at once, because some of the content is timeless. But the media along which we can convey content is rapidly changing. And so it gives people some sort of anchor to think these are timeless problems. Thousands of years, other people have, in fact, had this same feeling, which I'm actually certain is unique. No one's ever felt like this before. No one's ever felt lonely and strange in a classroom, but it happens all the time, always has. I want to be able to convey content about that in one of the new ways that are now available to me, and it's a great time to be alive.
In that question of the content and this moment we're in, I have found myself drawn back to faith. And, one of it prompted me to say, Mike, you got to come down to Austin. We were talking about this, and we were talking about our shared faith. I'm a cradle Catholic, and you've converted to Catholicism. And regular viewers will hear I occasionally put my Catholicism in there in bits and pieces. But of Christendom, I love the Catholic tradition because it is exactly that. I think it might have been you, and in that conversation that preceded this conversation, bringing up Montesquieu and saying that he and his, freedom is what was the formulation again?
The reason we care about liberty is so that we have the freedom to do what we ought to will.
And that he was actually a political philosopher who was also Catholic, who was building on and responding to Thomas Aquinas. Mm-hmm. And that Thomas Aquinas is part of this tradition, and St. Augustine, and that they're responding to what he was responding to was Descartes. And so Descartes is the black hole of scientific skepticism. So Descartes' claim is that you should be skeptical, you should doubt everything. So scientific doubt means that we can't believe anything that we can't prove for certain to be true. We don't have any beliefs, all we have is knowledge and ignorance. And the line is bright between it. Yes. And Descartes was trying to destroy religion, because it is by its nature a matter of belief. It is a leap of faith to things that cannot be proved. Now, each of us who has faith, there are some things that we think, okay, that's proof. That's why my faith is correct and real. But in scientific terms, you can't start from first observable principles and build all the way down. So the Cartesian revolution is part of what Montesquieu was arguing against. And that split, the Cartesian doubt that underlies a lot of not science, but scientism. I have a friend who's an evangelical atheist and will just teach atheism in class. And I say, I understand that you believe your metaphysics to be correct, but I think it would be wrong for me to teach my metaphysics. And he says, well, it would be wrong because you're mistaken. But I'm right. All of us believe that. We all believe our metaphysics are correct. He has no evidence. Right. It's just since he cannot, to his mind, decisively prove the existence of God, we're done. Well, there is a bunch of threads taking place right now, and I want to dig into how you think about this. One is what seems like the splintering and disintegration of that kind of atheism, the new atheists. Richard Dawkins has called himself a cultural Christian. That's come up in the past several months, but it's actually been something he's been saying for a long time. There's a lot of people who are in this sort of intellectual podcast, sort of public intellectual space who are saying similar things. Oh, I don't feel it. But I want to act as if, because it sure seems like it's better. It's better to have there be some notion that there is goodness. We aren't looking at an abyss. We can't sort of engineer a world we're somewhere between 1984 and Brave New World. Neither of those seem all that great. How do you come to these questions? Because they are the questions that feel like they're right there below the surface of the catastrophe mindset with climate and population and environmentalism, the wokeism. It's all got a kind of metaphysics religiosity to it.
A number of historians and psychologists have come to the conclusion that everybody worships. The only question is, what is it that we think gives our life meaning enough that we worship that thing? So environmentalists have a particular set of things that they worship. Christians, religious people, have a set of things that they worship. The two questions are my having a kind of emotional need to have a set of truths that give me answers to these questions, give me a kind of sense of safety. And most of us, when we look at other people's religious, or if I look at an atheist's religious, because that is a claim about metaphysics, I look at their beliefs, I think, I don't see how they can live like that. And they think the same thing about me. So the thing that is most difficult is, and John Locke, in his famous letter on toleration, which I think people should all read in the 7th or 8th grade, his conception of toleration was cultivating an acceptance of things you hate. It doesn't count if I don't care. I actually have to accept the fact that you believe something different than I do. So how is it that we can both have strong beliefs about what's important in the world, about the way we should organize our lives, which we know for certain to be true? You know, I have doubts about faith. There's all sorts of doubts. But I'm convinced that the way that I worship is the best. And everyone else believes exactly that same thing. They just disagree about what the content of those beliefs should be. How can we maintain a society of toleration where each of us actually authentically respects the ability and desire of other people to have their own beliefs that differ from ours? And that's something that societies have a tenuous connection with. And one of the problems is that some religious traditions that are less tolerant may be more attractive. So I have some Muslim friends that are very tolerant. I have some Muslims that are not friends, perhaps, but that I have met that are not tolerant at all. Mm-hmm. You don't get to believe something different. That has certainly also been true of Christians at a number of points in our history. We tend to be more tolerant now, although it could go the other way. So the strange thing is that some societies have managed to cultivate and perpetuate toleration. And toleration actually means that I will not just accept, but will venerate and protect your right to exercise something that I hate, that I disagree with.
On that principle, this is very much a liberal principle, classical liberal principle, a principle of the First Amendment, of the Constitution, of our founding fathers. It does feel like this might be a soft belly that is being cut and in liberalism. And it's sort of like, this is the very specific example. Maybe it's not that specific, but the principle of toleration is like the safe neighborhood. We all want to be able to live in a world in which each of us tolerates the other such that we all live in peace. But then you got a couple of whack job psychopaths who you can't really tolerate them because they'll murder you. And so in the physical space, this is actually an example of, no, there's certain behaviors that we cannot tolerate. Because they will destroy us.
And one of them is intolerance. What if there's some people who live in the neighborhood that are intolerant?
So like wokeism, which, you know, the sort of postmodern celebration of identity as a kind of essential character nature that cannot be overcome, and whose sort of celebration requires that other values are subordinate, including freedom of speech, expression, and tolerance. That is like, I think, what wokeism is. That is like the guy that is a psychopath, that wants to come, doesn't have empathy, a screw is loose, and will kill you and not care. It feels like it's the same thing. It's like, it is like a virus that's contagious if it's not contained and inoculated against. But it's also a set of ideas, and so like the tolerant liberal order seems to have allowed this thing to come in, and by golly, it's
susceptible. It is uniquely susceptible.
It does seem like it is almost like the virus analogy is especially apt. It has adapted to the liberal fitness environment, found its weakness, and sort of fine-tuned its spike proteins to attack to our receptors for toleration.
Because we cannot attack it. We have to allow it.
Do we? Do we need to allow it?
Or we have to stop becoming liberalism. We have to stop becoming liberals. So there is a set of questions called militant democracy or militant liberalism, where there are limits, there are rules. So democracy would say that anyone can make any argument that they want. Militant democracy would say, no, you cannot argue for ending democracy. You can make any argument for practicing democracy that you want, but you can't say, democracy's bad, I want to be elected and then become king. And for tolerance, I have to tolerate any claims that people want to make about the right way to live, but I don't have to tolerate someone who says, and you must obey me. But we're not very good at policing that. How will we decide who gets to say what? Because now we're back to the Munger test. The state's going to decide what people get to say. Oh, that's too intolerant. Mm-hmm. I don't want Nancy Pelosi or Donald Trump to be in charge of deciding what intolerance is. And so I have these two bad choices, and I'll admit that this is something I get stuck on. If we have some entity called the state, which is actually people, deciding, nope, that's intolerant, you don't get to say it, I don't know what's going to happen with that. But if we don't have it, the system can collapse because it's susceptible to this invasion by viruses.
So how serious of a threat to your philosophy does this represent, or to our shared philosophy? But you're really living this as an academic and as someone who's an intellectual leader in grappling with how people choose in groups. How do we end up with an outcome as a group of people who make decisions only inside here? What happens in the social order isn't a choice in the same way. It's an outcome that is that can go one way or the other based on sort of the rules of the game. And then we have to decide what the rules of the game are and then play by them for a time. Like, that's friggin' complicated, but it's the world we live in. This feels like a non-trivial challenge. I don't know how to deal with it. I don't know how to think about it.
It is a constant challenge. I'm a follower of John Stuart Mill on this, that we just have to try to allow freedom of speech on every question, and the only answer to speech I disagree with is more speech. I don't get to repress it. Now, is that going to solve misinformation and whatever that is on Twitter or Facebook? Maybe not, because you get these communities echo chambers where you get information cascades, and this is just simply not true. This is a deep fake. This person didn't say this. How can we stop it?
Yeah. Trump was not shot in the ear. It was the glass from the teleprompters, even though there's photos of the intact teleprompters and what kind of, like, the everybody's conspiracy theorists. It's on all sides. Like, oh, you think that I heard one person who would call himself QAnon that said last year that any day it was going to be announced that Donald Trump bought the Fed and is going to re-privatize it or something. It was like, well, that sounds like crackpottery.
Yeah.
But it's no more crackpot than the, like, assassination attempt was staged,
Yeah,
which is totally insane.
It's crackpot, not crackpot. And the question is, can we say, okay, no crackpots?
Yeah.
Who's going to say who the crackpots are? I don't know of an objective definition. I know it when I see it. But if we're going to put somebody in charge of that, they're going to be possessed of power so great that I think no human could resist misusing it. And so we've created a sword so powerful that if I lose control of it after the next election, I'm going to regret it, because my enemies are now going to be able to say all of what I do is a crackpot, which is why I have often come out as an academic in favor of extremist, leftist, I think, crackpots, saying, no, they have to be free to say that. Because if they're not, you're going to come for me next. Because I'm clearly a crackpot by any standard of the usual orthodox academic philosophy.
The greatest challenge to this, and I don't know, I don't have some political program that would like, oh, well, we should let the government do X, Y, and Z. I think mostly the government should go away and commit suicide, but as an enterprise. But
at least lose weight. Maybe not kill itself, but lose weight.
Become so emaciated that you're worried it will die, and then you don't even, and then you won't pay as much attention to it. But you said it early in our conversation that 1800 competition for the future of the presidency, John Adams versus the radical, maybe even anarchistic Thomas Jefferson, and Jefferson wins. Complete with the yellow journalism and the nonsense, like all the no fight today is any more ugly than that fight was in terms of politics and rhetoric and images of the two men in the newspaper. Like it was crazy.
They were talking about each other's mama.
It was like blood sport, like going for the throat. So people can talk about mean tweets from Trump or from whatever. It's all 1800 has you beat. That cultural, and I will just say that Christian context seems like it might be the water that the fish come to not realize is there. And that we have this freedom, but it is the freedom to try to pursue the good. And that's in the water, the Christian water of the good, of the I'm hanging on the cross. And hey, I forgive you anyway. I forgive them. That's a goodness that is inhuman goodness. It is not the human animal's natural goodness as an animal, like an alien comes to Earth and looks at the human animal. Wokeness actually looks more like the disgusting human animal, where you look a little different. I think I'll kill you and steal your stuff. Like that's more the human animal. If that goes away, is liberalism just a cut flower sitting in a vase waiting to die? And is that just the dialectic and Christian ethos may come back to save freedom once again, just as it birthed it in the first place?
Liberalism seems far more powerful and able to survive than its critics always think. We're always worried that this is the end, and then somehow liberalism comes back, and Germany restored liberalism after Hitler. Now, some of that you can say was a response to the excesses, but still, the difference between 1910, 1938, and 1950, people are capable of saying, no, we're going to move back in the direction of this system that works. I'm not sure that the underlying, if not Christian, then culturally Christian ethos is reproducible. So it mattered that there was a sense of toleration, and you should let your neighbor practice what they themselves believed, because it's just none of your business. If we start to believe that it is our business and we have to have uniform beliefs about a number of things, maybe not about religion, but politics, where I'm not willing to talk to someone. I taught a class this spring on campaigns and elections, and I asked my students, how many of you actually know well someone you respect who's going to vote for Donald Trump? And no one raised their hand. It may be that some of them were just afraid because it's a weird thing to admit. Think about that. Half the people in this country are going to vote for Donald Trump, and you don't know any. You should get out more. I would like for you in the next week to try to find someone and have a conversation with that person. But we don't do that. We're making excuses about how not only should we not take them seriously, they need to be canceled and gotten rid of. So I don't know if we can get that back. I suppose that there were times in the 1840s where people had this same sort of sense. And maybe it's always been the good luck of the United States to have the leader we needed at the particular time of crisis. But I don't see a leader on the horizon that it strikes me as being that person. Thank goodness that person is going to be president.
To push back on myself, I'm seeing this through a Western Christian Catholic background, but there's good societies that have come about without that firmament, especially I think of Asia in particular, like highly successful, well-ordered societies, whether it's Japan or, rising India or, China's got all kinds of problems, but China has hundreds and hundreds of millions of people living good lives, even and better lives than they used to live, certainly. So it isn't the case that the only instances of civilization are those that have been born out of Christendom. But I guess...
But it was the water our country was born in. You're not wrong about that.
And I do think, and this is maybe this show's called Dad Saves America, because I actually think America's pretty great. And you said it yourself, like we invented a bunch of stuff in terms of politics, not just technology, but politically, like the kind of freedom. We have been a shining city on the hill for all our faults. And so that thing, I don't want it to go away.
I don't want it to go away either. And I think having this conversation is one way of at least making it possible for people to realize it might go away. And that's a first step.
The ideals that we've been talking about and batting around, you need to be ready for that. You need to be I think we all want our kids to be intellectually curious and thoughtful and capable of learning and growing and building a life for themselves. How do you think about, based on you have a particular purview, you're seeing thousands of kids come through who have been raised through all different strategies in all different times now. What's your advice for parents?
I hope everyone will cultivate having serious conversations with people that they fundamentally disagree with. And that's not very easy for most people. So one of the things that I do in class, and I think that we should do this in high school, but it's hard because confronting the fact that people you disagree with may have decent arguments on their side is uncomfortable. So in my PPE capstone class, the main class at the top of the philosophy, politics, and economics sequence. So these are the Duke seniors who are also selected into PPE. They're pretty elite. They have to come to me, and we're going to find a really very difficult, emotionally charged question. And then they pair up, and on the day of the debate, we flip a coin to see which side they argue. So they have to have prepared both sides. They don't know until that minute. And a lot of them will pick a question they really care about. And then on the day, of course, they have to argue against it. And in the evaluations, almost uniformly, they will say, this changed my life. I have never attributed anything except stupidity or evil to people who disagree with me. And it turns out this is really complicated. And I still don't agree, but I could see how someone might believe that. So I think if you could get people doing that in probably elementary school is too early, middle school and high school, if they would take seriously those difficult questions and model the fact that there is some counter argument to this position. And so the first day of class, I say, you can stop me at any time and say, what is the best counter argument to that position? Anything that I say. And sometimes they'll ask, and I think, darn it, I wish they hadn't asked about that. But then I'll say, actually, I have trouble with the following arguments. And so I think if grown, and at the dinner table, if you can model that. Well, when your son accused you of whataboutism last night, you didn't say, I sort of bristled. No, it's not. But you laughed and said, yeah, okay, yes, it is. So modeling that, I think, if we can do that, and then from that goes out the concentric circles, like after you throw a rock in the pond, to this idea of toleration and debate, they'll be much better citizens of the world, whether they go to Duke or community college.
I ask this of every guest. This show is called Dad Saves America because I think that's a role we play as men that ladders up to keeping the country be the place I love. How do you think about your role, not just as a father, but more broadly, in the American story?
I'm a patriot, not a nationalist. So I said before, a nationalist is someone who says my country right or wrong. A patriot is someone who believes their country can be great and that I have obligations to make sure that that happens. So I run for public office. Right now, I'm running for the North Carolina House, District 40. I learned so much from talking to voters about what things they care about, trying to frame the issues that I'm going to argue in ways that they find persuasive. And so I think we have an obligation to participate at the narrow little micro level. And some of this could just be having conversations with people where you say, why do you believe that? So if I hear something that I disagree with, instead of saying, well, that's wrong, even though it is, how do you believe that? And a lot of times I learn stuff, and I've changed my mind about some of those things. So that seems like a pretty small thing, but if you practice that most of the time that you're having conversations, you're actually a better conversationalist. So there's an instrumental reason for doing it, but you'll also learn a lot. And so the thing that I think we can all do is try to talk to people we think we disagree with and see if we can at least understand why they have this different point of view.
Mike Munger, thanks for being on Dad Saves America.
It was a pleasure. Thank you.